Well, welcome to my talk today. My name is Tom Sterner, and I'd like to start out by giving a little bit of a backstory as to the person I was, the person I am, and how I've gotten to be in a place here where you're watching me and listening to me. Um, as a youngster, I was a very spiritual person, and but I grew up in a family that where the parents were relatively, by today's standards, they were certainly uneducated. My father did not have a complete high school education, and my mother did graduate from high school. But they grew up during the Depression. They certainly weren't worldly, and we went to Presbyterian church. I went to Sunday school, like so many kids back in the 1960s. That created an issue for me because I had all of this curiosity about the universe, about God, um, and I wanted to understand it. In fact, I was reading the Bible on my own volition every day. In fact, I bought several different versions of the Bible because I wanted to understand what the different perspectives were. And again, this is when I was maybe 8 years old. I even did side jobs so I could afford other religious texts at the time. And I think I was probably a little bit of a pest, with the Sunday school teacher because I would ask things like, I was very aware of my thoughts, which is unusual, I think. In other words, I had a perspective of I'm not my thoughts, and I was having these thoughts, and I was tormented by my thoughts, until later in life, because I couldn't control them, and I thought I should be able to. And I remember one time saying to the Sunday school teacher at a very young age, I was probably about 6 or 7. She was telling us about how Jesus was always listening to our thoughts, and he wanted us to not have bad thoughts. And I said, well, I have bad thoughts, and why do I have bad thoughts? And her answer was, well, because the devil makes you have bad thoughts. And just following the logic of a child, I said, well, is the devil stronger than God? And she said, no. I said, well, is God, why doesn't God just take care of him? Then none of us will have bad thoughts. And she said, well, he's going to. And I said, well, what is he waiting for? And well, that was pretty much the end of the conversation at that point, as you can imagine, because there was nowhere to go. But this was the kind of personality I had. I really was a digger. I wanted to know everything that I could about myself and about how I interacted with the universe. When I was in high school, it became very aware to myself in my own observation of myself that I was very undisciplined. And again, I noticed that it was almost like an obsessive compulsive disorder. I was tormented by some of my thoughts, certainly not all of them. I wasn't an unhappy person, but I was stressed and I was a worrier. And I realized that I didn't finish a lot of tasks that I started. And I wasn't in control of that. I would burn up the initial desire and incentive that got me involved in the task in the first place. Maybe that was playing a musical instrument, maybe it was gymnastics or whatever. And then I would start to make excuses for not practicing. And it was interesting because I was aware, even at a young age, that I wanted all the benefits that practicing was going to give me. I just hated the practice. And I thought there's got to be a way around this. So by the time I was a senior in high school, I knew that I had to find an answer to this. Otherwise, I was never going to reach my potential, and I was never going to have a sense of inner peace. So I didn't have the faintest idea where to look. But then when I got in college in my first year, a very close friend of mine was taking a Philosophies of the World course. And I believe it was Houston Smith's book, Religions of the World. He gave that to me and said, I think you'd really like this. And he was right. I ate that up. It was my first exposure to Eastern thought. And then I was just on fire with it. I read everything I could about all of the different Eastern thought systems. And it changed my life. It changed me. I began to really understand what present moment thinking was. And I began meditating and all of this on my own. And I should also say that I had a very unusual job, which was I was a high-level concert piano technician and piano remanufacturer. It's very difficult to explain to people the redundancy, the repetition, the tediousness of working on pianos, because everything on a piano has to happen at least 88 times. So if you're working on, say, the keyboard has 5,000 action parts. There's 34 adjustments per note. Each adjustment is interdependent on other adjustments. So when you change one adjustment by a very, very tiny amount, a 64th of an inch, a 32nd of an inch, it changes the relationship in the whole powertrain, and you have to constantly refine it. And the reason it's a very big part of concert work is because concert pianists push the piano to its limit. And if everything isn't perfect, the piano won't keep up with them. So I had to do that work on a daily basis. I did it for almost 30 years. And it gave me a really good incubator because I worked alone in solitude all the time. All those years, I was working alone in solitude, and I had to do this work that was extremely boring. But I had to focus at my highest level. And it gave me the opportunity to look at what I was reading, whether it was about Zen or later sports psychology or whatever, and then apply it to what I was doing on a daily basis and hone my skills in that. And at the same time, because I was very aware of my observer and the thoughts that were happening, I was noticing how I was processing that whole system. And that was when, by the time I got into my mid 20s, I had everybody was telling me I was the most disciplined person they knew, which I thought was kind of funny because I didn't really see myself different than I was when I was a kid. But when I started looking at my accomplishments, I realized that that was actually true. I was a pretty disciplined person, and I loved it. I had infinite patience. I was content. I didn't experience the stress that I used to, and I thought, I need to write about this. And that was the first book, called The Practicing Mind. The book, unimaginably to me, was so successful that I ended up getting out of the piano business and doing this. The second book was Fully Engaged, which was basically another 7 chapters on the practicing mind. And the latest book, which is most of what I'm going to focus on here, is called It's Just a Thought: Emotional Freedom Through Deliberate Thinking. And that came in the last couple of years because there's information that has come out now. I actually started writing The Practicing Mind in the early 90s. There's information that wasn't available back then. And now we live in a very fortunate time because in our empirical sciences, we are able to actually document stuff that Eastern thought had known for thousands of years. And a perfect example of that is gamma waves. For thousands of years, Tibetan monks and other meditators were reaching a state of gamma waves in their meditations, which gave them access to all sorts of frequency data that we didn't even know existed. But they had no way of communicating that because they didn't operate empirically, meaning they had to have machines and everything to prove this data out. They just were internal explorers, and they went inside and they explored themselves and had these experiences, but there was no way for them to communicate that to an outward source. It's sort of like, if you go to the beach and you try to describe a sunset to someone who's never been to the beach, how do you do that? How do you describe what it feels like to fall in love if someone has never fallen in love? It's a complete conscious, interconscious experience. And it's real when you have it, but you can't give it to somebody because it's beyond linguistics. And so there was, from the Western perspective, there was a certain amount of doubt about that. And now, I should say empirical science generally lags behind in most of these things because it's dependent on apparatus that can actually observe the phenomena. And now we have MRIs, and we can look at people's brains and what they're doing when they go into meditation and all that sort of stuff, and we can actually validate with hard data. And so in the West, we tend to feel more comfortable when that happens, and we feel more comfortable investing in that because we feel like it's not some hairy fairy, voodoo type thing. And what happened is I read about an experiment recently where they brought in these, what they called Olympic meditators, because they wanted to see how far they got, what their brain waves were when they were in deep meditation. And what they found was that these
these meditators could go into gamma in minutes and stay there as long as they wanted. Now, the reason this is so significant is that the average person only hits gamma maybe 1.5 to 2 seconds a couple times a day. So the observers of this, the people that were studying it, they were like, we have no idea what that experience is like, but we know it's real. And so I think that this is what makes this such an exciting time, because we really have begun to understand what thought is, how our thoughts interact with the universe, the field, God, source, whatever you choose to call it. And we can actually measure this information, and we can prove that this is real. We don't understand all of it, but you have to understand that. I was giving a talk in a corporate room one day, and I said, look, electricity has been here ever since time began. We just didn't know it. It would have heated your house 1,000 years ago. It would have lit your lights 2,000 years ago. It's always been here. Just because we didn't know it doesn't mean it didn't exist. We didn't know it existed, and so we couldn't use it. But now I said, look at what we do with it. So now we have access to this information that is showing us how powerful our thoughts are, and how important it is for us to take responsibility for what thoughts we're having. So moving on to more of what I would like to talk about, I just want to start this out by saying that there's nothing I'm going to say today that its core foundation doesn't start with a simple realization, and that is, I'm not my thoughts. I have thoughts, some of which I deliberately create, but most of my thoughts I don't create. The thoughts are created for me, and I experience the thoughts. And that's where the conundrum is, because if you do not have thought awareness, in other words, if you do not know what it feels like to be the observer of the thought versus in the thought, then you're a puppet of the thinking. There's a saying that says thoughts, they're wonderful servants, but they're terrible masters. And that's where most of us live. And if you look at neuroscience today, it says that 95% of our day, we're living programs. We're not actually critically thinking and creatively thinking. There's things that are happening outside of us that our subconscious looks at as a stimulus. And when that happens, it goes and gets what it thinks is the appropriate response. So I want to talk about that for just a minute. The language of the subconscious is, and understand, I can't cut your brain and take a piece out and say, there's your subconscious. We're talking about the entity of the mind, but these are different aspects: the conscious, the unconscious, the subconscious. The subconscious mind has a job to do, and it's really, really good at it. It's literally a million times faster than your conscious mind. So it's very important. It logs information and stores it very accurately. It's always watching. And that's the reason why you don't need to learn how to walk every day when you get up, or button your shirt, or put a spoonful of food in your mouth. It takes care of all of that. And if you fall, we immediately switch from conscious into subconscious, and it triggers everything that needs to happen in your body to keep your balance. So the subconscious is not our enemy. It's just, if we don't understand how it works, then it is using us instead of us using it. So the language of the subconscious is it's pretty much feeling. What it does is it watches how situations make us feel. And it assumes that your reaction to that, the feelings that you have in that particular situation, is the truth. The subconscious mind does not critically think. It doesn't have a sense of humor. It doesn't analyze. It just records data. And so when you are in a situation where somebody comes in a room and that person annoys you, then your reaction, your emotional reaction is, that person annoys me. The subconscious looks at that information and says, okay, when this scenario, we'll correlate, if it's this scenario or something close to this, that is, the file for that is to feel annoyed. So what it does is it writes that down. And then what happens is when a like situation happens in the future, it goes, oh, here it is. Go get the file number 308-B and play it. And then you have that experience, and you're completely immersed in the emotional content of the response.
You are not, you have no say in that. You're just being, you're basically being played. And so you cannot control this if you're not aware that it's happening. When you get that awareness, then you get the privilege of choice. It doesn't mean that, well, now it's easy. Like it's, and I'd like to point out that words like difficult, easy, we live in a system where we try to describe what we're feeling using a linguistic system that is woefully inadequate. Difficult is not an absolute word. What's difficult to one person is not difficult to another. What is an anxious situation to one person is not an anxious situation to another. So it's not like we could say, yes, getting up in front of people, talking like this is very, very scary. Well, it isn't scary for me, but it is scary for some people. So it's the information, the process that I'm living in right here, talking to you, is just that. Then I have an interpretation of that, which is I've developed and I've installed over time, that will determine how I'm going to experience it. So if I don't pull myself out of that loop of trigger, response, and then whatever the emotional content that comes with that, then I'm always going to be a slave to the system. The beauty is that now that we understand that, we have the ability to reprogram that. The strength of that response will be just as strong if we overwrite it with a different response. That new response will be just as strong as the response that is making us feel uncomfortable. And I work with a lot of people. I've been doing this for about 25 years, and I can tell you that this system here pervades everyone's life, and it is in control of everyone's life. And we also live in a time where we're being, in my mind, intentionally distracted all the time with stressful thoughts. Our minds are overactive. We don't have stillness. People don't even know how to sit still anymore. In Nicholas Carr's book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, he talks about how when he used to be a voracious reader, and he said he's in his 50s, and when he tries to read, he said, I can't go for more than about 10 minutes. He said, and then I feel like I have all these impulses. I need to check my email. I need to do this. I need to do that. He said, I have trouble reeling my mind in and being in this moment, doing what I'm doing right now. Alan Watts said that we are a slave to time, even though time doesn't really exist. According to the physicists, he said we are a slave to time. And the reason is because we live most of our life someplace we aren't. We're in the future, we're in the past. But the only point of reality is what is happening right now. And so we can't control that, and you can't experience that if you don't first develop what I call thought awareness. You have to become aware of what your mind is doing without your permission. So one time I was working with some high school kids, and I told the kids that we were going to do this simple exercise, and I wanted them to shut their cell phones off, and I wanted them to close their eyes and stop thinking for 2 minutes. Now, I knew that there was no way they could do this. I knew just because pretty much no one can do it. But I mean, certainly there are people that can slow their mind down quite a bit, and there are people that can do it. But my point is not today's teenagers. And what happened was, at 2 minutes, I clicked the bell off, and they immediately, this was an epiphany for these kids. They had no idea that even when they were willing their mind to stop thinking, it wouldn't obey them. They had no control over it. And they didn't, and I said to them, so what did you learn here? What you learned is that if you're using your will and you're telling your mind, this is what I want you to do, and it's saying, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, then who's in control during the day? Because it isn't you. And this was a real experience for these kids, because it was the first time they had ever been exposed to this particular type of an experience. And many of them went into a meditation practice on their own, not through me, but on their own, because I later got contacted by their parents, who said that it had really changed them, that it had changed their academic scores, everything, because their mind was so much better at focusing when they wanted it to, and they were more aware of when they were being thought, which is most of the time
all of us are being thought. So, why is this important? Because everything that we do, personal transformation takes time, and interpretation will create your experience. So personal transformation is a skill. People ask me, is The Practicing Mind your first book? Is that about mindfulness? And I say, actually, no. I said, mindfulness is in The Practicing Mind, but The Practicing Mind is not in mindfulness. And when they ask me to explain that, I say, well, the Practicing Mind is about learning to become immersed and fall in love in the process and with the process of becoming mindful. Mindfulness is a skill. And like all skills, you have to know the mechanics of developing the skill. It's no different than learning a golf swing or writing skills. You have to understand what are the mechanics of proficiency and what are the mechanics to get to proficiency as quickly as possible. But then you have to repeat them. And, once you understand that, how do you experience? What's your interpretation of that process? Are you feeling like I can't be happy until I get to this place down here? Or can you fall in love with this moment right now as you work in the process of becoming mindful? Skill always starts here at 0 skill, and then it moves along the line of mastery. So we spend about 98% of our time in our life achieving mastery in whatever skills it is, whether it's raising children, whether it's your job dealing with difficult people, whether it's running a company, whether it's your golf swing, it doesn't matter. We spend most of our time in that. That's where we spend it, is in the process of achievement. It just makes sense to learn to love being there than feeling like I can't be happy until I have the goal. When in reality, if you run a race, what makes stepping over the finish line so gratifying? It's everything that went into being able to run the race. That's what makes it. If I just put a chalk line on the street and say, step over that, there's the finish line, it means nothing. And we really need to get that through our heads, because it's a bad habit we have when we attach to the goal. What we do is immediately put ourselves at war with the process of achieving it. And that process becomes something that we have to go through in order to get to this, quote, experience that we think we're going to have. But if we didn't go through that experience wouldn't exist. And so the whole thing is what we need to fall in love with. I wrote about in The Practicing Mind, there was a section about, in the 1970s, I used to be very into target archery. And in the Olympics, the American coaches were frustrated because the American and basically all Western archers were getting trumped by the Asian archers. And the reason was a fundamental difference in how they approached target shooting. And that difference was that the Americans, their goal was to get bullseyes. Got to get bullseyes. We win if we get more bullseyes. The Asians were aware of the goal, but it was just a rudder that steered their energy effort. Their idea, their goal was the perfect draw and release of the arrow. And so they were, when their mind was engaged in shooting the arrow, that's where it was engaged at. They let the arrow go with a complete detachment, and the bullseye just got in the way. The Americans were completely attached to seeing the arrow go in the bullseye. So when they would pull the bow, it was really like this thing they had to do to energize the arrow so they could let it go and see if they got a bullseye. So it was a very different perspective. And then what would happen is their shot was always filled with judgment. If it was high, left, and everything, they would say, I only have 3 shots. Now I'm down 1. I got to make up that shot with this shot. There's all this internal dialogue that was, it was sucking up cognitive ability in their mind, because the conversation was happening. And it's like, you think about like a computer with RAM. You only got so much RAM. The brain only has so much RAM. That's why I habitualize this stuff. So this thing is, this conversation is going on. There's a certain amount of B rating that is with the person. I should have made that. I can't believe I missed it. That kind of stuff is going on, which is impacting their emotional content. And all these things are sabotaging their natural athletic ability to fire the arrow. And so now when you look at the Olympics, this mindset of it's everywhere. It doesn't matter what sport you're talking about. You're not competitive unless your whole goal is to stay in the present moment. That's where your power comes from. And that's when you have the opportunity through thought awareness training to see what thought is this situation creating in my mind. Is it serving me? Is it taking me where I want to go? Or does it need an adjustment or maybe a total rewrite? I feel, when something upsets me, I realize that when I say upset, it's like, well, people say, well, this is difficult. I don't know what that means, because what's difficult to one person isn't difficult to another. But what we try to do is we try to pull this, take a look at this feeling that is beyond linguistics, and then kind of put it into something that we can communicate to other people. So when I say something is upsetting me, I'm saying that I'm noticing it. You don't notice the stuff that you're good at. You don't notice the stuff that's easy because it's easy. It just flows past you. If you look at what you pay attention to during the day, it's generally the stuff that you find gives you a sense of what I'll call struggle. And so if you look at what I said earlier about the subconscious mind, well, when I react to a situation and I notice that I'm feeling like I'm struggling, there was a time in my life where I would have said, I hate this. This is difficult. I wish I wouldn't have to do this. All these things. Now I'm curious, because what I realize is I told myself to react this way. I told myself, or I let other people tell me, and I installed it, and the subconscious is dutifully playing back the program that I wrote. And so when I feel that way, it's like, isn't this interesting? This is how I told myself, like, why in the world I did that? But we don't do it intentionally because we're not conscious that we're doing it. So now that I'm conscious, I treasure that information, because what it does is it tells me, okay, you're not very good at this situation. You're in the process of building this skill to deal with this situation. And here's your opportunity to do it. Here's your opportunity to rewrite the code. And how do you rewrite the code? Well, the very first thing is you have to notice that the opportunity to rewrite the code is there. That's the first thing. And you have to realize that you can't rewrite the code unless you're in the situation. You have to be in the situation in order to have the experience and then work with whatever your tactics are. So, for example, I had a young girl, a high school girl that I was working with, and she was a very high-level golfer. And she had asked me to work with her because when she was playing well, nobody could beat her. But as she started to have a bad day, then she began to implode. She became her worst enemy. She would lose her temper with herself, lose patience with herself. And she said, I just can't seem to get out of it. Well, she didn't understand that it's just a thought. You're not your thoughts. That's just a reaction that you have told yourself to have when you have a bad shot. So we just need to teach you that you have the opportunity to change that. So there was a tournament that she had waited all year for. It was a qualifying tournament. If she placed in the tournament first, second, third, she would have the opportunity to play in a professional event. And so she was very, very attached to doing well in this tournament. And she certainly had the ability to win it. She had proven that during the school year. She had broken records, a lot of co-ed tournaments. She was out driving boys. She was a really good player. And when I got to the tournament that day, when it finally came, normally they weren't allowed to have a caddy. They had to carry their own bag. But in this particular tournament, for some reason, they were allowed to have a caddy. So she asked me if I would carry her bag for her. And I did. And I think she thought it would be an advantage because like I was going to coach her in course management or something. I wasn't concerned about that. I was more concerned with how will she deal with bad shots? And so when I got to the tournament and I saw her on the driving range, I could see immediately that she did not have the swing that was natural to her. She was trying to steer the ball. She was trying not to hit a bad shot instead of just letting go and letting the talent that she had proven to herself that she had, just let that play. And I didn't want to say something to her because I thought, it could just be, nerves, and she'll get over it after she hits a few shots. Well, she blew her first ball into the woods. And then as I walked behind her, or with her, she just hit one bad shot. I mean, she just totally imploded. Everything she was afraid of happened. She was so attached to not playing bad that she basically was saying to her subconscious mind, I hope I don't play bad. Now, the subconscious mind looks at that and says, it doesn't read the don't. It reads the feelings that she was having, the emotional feelings, and those feelings go along with playing bad. So that was what he got her. It got her, the swing timing was off. It got her all that stuff like that would make her play bad. It just gave her what it thought she was asking for. And by the time I got, 5 or 6 holes into it, she was just completely out of the tournament. So I thought, well, initially I didn't want to say anything because I thought, what good is it for her to work with me if she can't figure this stuff out? She has enough data. I've given her enough information, and she wasn't getting it. So I said to her, as we're walking down the fairway, chasing one of her errant shots, I said, why did you ask me to work with you? And she said, I asked you to work with me so that I could overcome this situation that I'm in right now. And I said, how do you think you do that? And she said, Tom, I don't know. I've tried everything I know, and it's not working. And I said, I think you're missing the point of my question. The point of my question is, you can't overcome this situation unless you're in this situation. We spent a year talking about different strategies, things you can do, but you can't try those strategies. You can't figure it out unless you're in the situation. This situation is really a blessing for you. I said, it's not going to determine, this tournament is a one-day tournament. It's not going to determine whether you become a professional golfer or you get a college scholarship or any of that. What it is giving to you is an opportunity of you playing bad, but having the perspective of the observer and noticing that your thinking is working against you. So now you have 12 holes left to figure out how to change that. I said, and you have enough information to do that. I said, so why don't you just let go of winning this tournament? Because you're not going to win it. I said, that's over with. That chance is gone. And focus on the opportunity that's in front of you. Well, as soon as she did that, everything clicked. Her swing came back. She started striping the ball. And the joy in her face, she was skipping down the fairways. And she told me on the 18th hole, as we walked down the fairway for the last hole, she said, Tom, if I had a choice, I would give up every tournament I won, every trophy I won, every record I broke this year for this experience. She said, I didn't think it was possible for me to turn how I felt about this situation around. I just didn't think it was possible. It wasn't that I couldn't do it. I just didn't think anybody could do it. It was completely out of my reach. And she said, now I realize how important and integrated my thinking is in terms of my interpretation. I said, your interpretation of the experience determine what you experience, which then creates how you perform in the situation. So when I experience a sense of struggle, my definition of struggle is that I'm up against my threshold. That's all it is. It's just data. Your emotions don't know they make you upset. They're just data. It's data, electromagnetic energy encoded with data. That's all it is. It doesn't know I'm going to give him this feeling, which I know is going to upset him, but I'm going to have to give it to him anyway. It doesn't work that way. It gives you information. What you do with that information is your choice. And if you understand this, you can you can interpret the emotion differently. When you interpret the emotion differently, the subconscious mind responds differently because you're asking it for something different. And so it is a skill. And the hardest part, or I shouldn't say that hard, because hard doesn't really exist depends on who you are, but learning how to voice how to put the sentence together. When you're putting it, what is my interpretation of this situation, is to be able to stay in the observer and then to choose your words, to understand how is my subconscious going to interpret the words I'm using right now. So here's another example. I had a high school kid that won the club championship. He was going into college. I did a clinic for these college kids, And he said, I'm going to give you a scenario. He said, I'm on the 18th hole. I have a one-shot lead, and I have a choice to make. My choice is there's a pond of water in front of the green. I could go for the green and carry the pond, just take it out of play. And if I do that, I've got a pretty good chance of making a birdie and increasing my lead to 2. He said, but of course, if it goes in the pond, I will lose my lead and quite possibly lose the tournament. I could play out to this side and play totally safe, and then I won't have to worry about that. And then I can come when my approach shot, it will be a no-brainer. He said, I'll just go out there and hit it. He said, what should I do? He said, should I take the risk? And I said, well, there's a lot of factors to that. The guy that's one stroke behind you, is he next to you, or is he got 9 holes to play? I said, we're not going to talk about that. Let's just talk about what you just told your subconscious. You said, should I take the risk? So when you said that, the subconscious said, go get the swing and the mechanics and the timing and everything that he expresses when he feels like he's taking a risk. And that's when you see all the time, when I play with people, like, I just told myself not to do that, when they hit something bad. And I'm like, yeah, so you did it. Like, I said, isn't the subconscious amazing? It really works well. Like, and I said, what you really should do is you should think, if you were out there on the fairway and you had no obstacles in front of you and it was just an easy 7-iron, that's what you should be picturing in your mind. That's what you should be feeling. When you feel that, your subconscious would go and get you that swing. So this is where there's so much power, because you have to learn to separate yourself and be the observer and the watcher of, how am I interpreting this situation so that I can be in control of it? You should be the gatekeeper of your thoughts. You should decide, this thought gets through, that thought doesn't get through, because I know where that thought's going to take me. And I've been there many times, and it's not serving my happiness, and it's not going to produce. Every thought produces something. A bad golf swing, there's a lot of mechanics that have to happen for a bad golf swing. You got to do a lot of things wrong. So it's not like it doesn't produce anything. And when you react to a situation, whether it's like, so I just had somebody yesterday who had an interaction with one of their kids, and the child is young, and the child got the best of her. And, she reacted in a way that she really regretted. And so, when we talked about that, and I said, well, see, that is like, how do you get ahead of that? Like, how do you get out in front of that so that you're not surrendering your decision-making to the child? Because at that point, the child is in control of how you're reacting, not you. And I said, that's what this is all about, is learning to be aware of your thoughts. And once you have thought awareness, and there is a practice for that, but, it is a skill. It's nothing more than a skill. It's a skill that you can learn. It's a skill that you practice. And it doesn't take that long. I can tell you from working with so many people, it doesn't take that long before you begin to really experience it consciously. There's a belief and there's a knowing. A belief is like, well, I can tell you what it feels like to fall in love, but that's not a knowing. When you fall in love, now you know what it feels like to fall in love. There's a big, big difference. And to me, there's a very big difference between being in your thoughts and watching the thoughts that your mind is creating without your permission. Those are very different perspectives. And most people, as neuroscience says, spend 95% of their time during the day being thought. They're in the thought. They're in the emotional content of the thought. I've given this example many times. I had a CEO one time, and we were having this conversation, and he said he didn't believe it. He wasn't on board with it. He wasn't on board with the idea that his true self wasn't in control all the time, because the observer is the true self. And to make a point with him, when he finished that, I said, did I tell you to talk? I said, I don't think I told you to talk. I want you to sit there and keep your mouth shut. I'll tell you when you can talk. And of course, as soon as I did that, he became offended. And then I said, now, did you decide to become offended? How does it feel right now? Is it a comfortable feeling? Is it where you want to be? You gave up control to me, and I manipulated you. I knew I could manipulate you because you're so unaware of it. And he just started to laugh. And he said, thank you for the awakening. He said, I totally get what you're saying now. And I said, well, this is where most of us live most of our life. But now we have all of this data that says we don't have to, that we have the power to change that. Now, something else, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I did want to say that the decisions you make by being aware of your thoughts can completely change the outcome of what you experience. So an example of that was years ago when I was in concert work. I worked for a number of theaters, and I prepared their pianos for the best pianists in the world. I mean, very demanding pianist. And there was a very well-known, I'm not going to name him, but a very well-known pianist who at the time had a drinking problem. I was completely unaware of this, but it put him in a position where he was susceptible to mood swings. And the way that the theater worked the piano was they had to store it underneath of the stage because they had ballet and plays and all sorts of stuff. And the piano was big and they just didn't have room for it to always be on stage, and they didn't want to get it damaged. So they would store it underneath of the stage. The problem with that was pianos are wood and felt, and they expand and contract with humidity, and the characteristics, the personality of the piano can change considerably when it's stored in an uncontrolled environment, which would happen with this concert grand. So their practice was to pull the piano out a day or so before, maybe 2 days before, let it sit on the stage and acclimate. And then I would come in and spend maybe 6 or 7 hours on the piano preparing it for the artist. So they weren't allowed to touch the piano until I had that time on it, because the piano would just be cacophonious when they brought it up from underneath the stage. So the piano, this is what happened this day. This guy came into town and he wasn't supposed to show up until about 5 o'clock on Saturday night, which was when the event was. Instead, he came over on Saturday morning. And so the piano, I hadn't touched it. It was just really raw. And there was a young stage hand there who let him in, which he should have never done. But he didn't know that. And so the guy sat at the piano and he was just absolutely livid. He was furious. He was calling me. He didn't know me, but he knew they had a piano technician, calling me all kinds of names and incompetent, etc. So the kid calls me at home and says, what do I do? And I said, well, I'll come in, and I'll deal with it. I said, you can't deal with it. So as I left the house, my initial reaction was what you would expect. I was mad at this kid because I thought, you have dumped me down a rabbit hole that is going to be almost impossible to get out of, because this guy has already decided that he really hates this piano. And now I have to convince him that he likes it. And that's going to be awful tough to do. But that was only in my mind because I was very far along with what I've been talking to you about for a few seconds. And then I immediately, aware that I was having this thought reaction, my subconscious had gotten this reaction for me because it said, well, usually when someone does this to you, you feel this way. I recognized that pattern. And I said, let's back this up and let's take control. And I'm riding in on the freeway. And I said, what can I control and what can I not control? And I thought, I can control myself. I can't control anything that he does or anything that he says. I can control what I say to him and how I behave towards him. I can't control how he receives that information. I can't control how he processes that information. But I can control his reaction to it, how I react to it. And so I thought, so what is my goal? I need a simple goal. And I said, my simple goal is I'm not going to allow him to touch my inner peace. I don't care what he says, how much he insults me, how much he yells. My focus of attention is going to be on my inner peace. That's what I'm going to be monitoring. Where are we now, Tom? He's yelling at you. Where are we? Like, just stay flatlined, don't stay out of the ego, stay out of the ego. Don't feel like you have to prove yourself right. Just stay out of the ego and soften his blows. Well, I get to the theater and I start, he's not on stage when I first got there, and I started stripping out the piano to start working on it. And then of course, here he comes and he's mad. I thought, well, I better strike the first blow. So I wanted him to understand, and this was compassion.
It was honest to goodness compassion and sensitivity on my part. I stood up, I introduced myself. I said, I'm Tom. I said, I want to apologize to you for having to tolerate this piano in this condition. I said, I want you to understand that I know the position that you're in. I said, you're playing by yourself as a solo artist. There's no orchestra here with you. And I said, and it doesn't matter how good you are, what levels of proficiency or excellence that you've accomplished. I said, if this piano won't keep up with you, nobody in the audience is going to know that, and they're not going to care. All they're going to do is say, you didn't play well. I said, when really the piano was holding you back. And I said, it's my job to make sure that doesn't happen, because I can understand why you're pretty naked out there. And as I'm saying this to him, his whole body language is changing. His face is changing. The anger is just flowing out of him and everything. And he was really kind of confused, I think. And he said, because he had nothing to be angry about at that point. And he said, what did you say your name was? And I said, it's Tom. And he goes, well, he said, Tom, no one has ever talked to me this way. He said, and I feel very comfortable with you. He said, because you do understand why I'm so scared of going out there and not having an instrument that will stay up with me. I said, we'll make it stay up with you. I said, you just let me work on it. We'll make it happen. I said, we're a team and we'll make it happen. We got plenty of time. And so he said, well, I'm going to get down to the green. I said, you go down there and then I'll come down and get you when I get done. So I worked on the piano for a couple of hours. I went down. I said, why don't you come up and give me your first draft opinion? He said, I don't need to, Tom. He said, I really don't need to. He said, I understand you. You understand me. That's good enough for me. I'll be fine. And he didn't even come up and play it. And the show went really, really good. It was standing ovations. He got great write-ups, but that wasn't the end. 2 years later, he came back into town and he was playing in a different venue, which called me to work on the piano. When I walked into the theater, he was up on the stage and I'm walking down the aisle to go up to the stage, and he's playing on the piano and he turns and he looks at me and he says, oh my gosh, I am so happy to see you. And I'm so glad that you're the guy they sent, Tom. He remembered my name. I said, well, how's the piano? He said, it's okay, but you'll figure it out. And I'm perfectly comfortable just walking away from it and letting you do your thing. And he said, are you coming to the show? And I said, well, I didn't even know you were in town. I said, I'd love to, but I said, I can't get a ticket now. He said, I'll get you a ticket in the front row. He said, it'll be at the box office for you. He said, I'd love for you to come. Now, we were at that point, we were friendly with each other, and it all came. We could have been at war. It could have been a screaming match. And if that had happened in the original concert, what would have happened is he would have been, he would have been in a bad mood. He would have played poorly. The audience would have gotten a bad show. It would have stayed with him. It would have upset my day. Instead, the whole thing turned around and was this wonderful experience. And that all came from me being aware of the programming that had been installed into my subconscious, me being aware that it was playing out and that I was not that program. That program wasn't me, and I wasn't going to let it control me. And that was what freed me. That's real power to me. If you can't control your thoughts, you don't have any power. I don't care how much money you make. If you can't control your thoughts, then you're always being controlled by your outer environment and by the people around you. They're always in control. And your happiness is only as good as the next person or situation that pleases you. And that, I don't consider that to be real power. And I love talking about this stuff. There's so much I could talk about, but not in this amount of time. Thank you so much.